Sunday night on The Attorney is going to be joined by Josh Wright of the firm of Hollis, Wright. Hard to believe that, decades later, still asbestos is an issue.
We're going to be talking about asbestos on Sunday night, and you're right. For something that was banned in 1970 and 1989 by the EPA and the consumer protection groups, it's still prevalent in today's society, and it still rears its ugly head, causing things like asbestosis and mesothelioma, and it's a significant issue that requires a show to talk about it, because people that have been diagnosed with these type of injuries have a very short period of time to file their lawsuit, even though their exposure may have been 10 to 40 years ago.
Yeah, so if you have someone that a good long while ago may have been exposed, you still have options. We'll talk about those on Sunday night, so be sure and join us, Josh Wright, and hopefully your questions, ways you can join the conversation. We'll see you on Sunday night right after WBTM 13 News.
Car crash cases, defective products, dangerous drugs, injuries, and abuse. Across the state of Alabama, the attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright, are here to serve you. Your tough legal questions answered by our experts. The attorneys with Josh Wright from the law firm of Hollis Wright and host David Lamb.
Hello and welcome into The Attorneys. We appreciate you spending your Sunday evening with us. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about a topic that you may have heard of before. Can you believe there are still issues with asbestos? We're going to talk about that tonight, have a panel of experts to deal with that subject matter, and we'd love to have you be a part of the conversation. Easy to do so. There's an attorney standing by. The number you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you call that and you can speak with an actual attorney. Also, you can text or email, however you prefer, being a part of the conversation. Would love for you to do so. Leading up and heading up our conversation tonight, Josh Wright of the firm Hollis Wright. Good to see you, sir.
You too. Hope you had a great week.
I did. Thank you.
Things well in your
Things
life? You doing well?
How about yours?
Good, good. We're going to be talking about an interesting topic tonight, asbestos. And you know, your intro was actually pretty good. If you can believe it, there are still asbestos cases, right?
It is hard to
believe.
believe.
There are a lot of asbestos cases. There's a reason for that. About 10,000 people per year in our country still die of asbestos-related injuries, which is an unbelievable number. And sometimes the latency period, or the period by which from exposure and injury to the time that you actually manifest that injury and show that injury, can be as long as 10 to 40 years. And so, you know, asbestos is still pretty prevalent. It's still an issue that people deal with, and those injuries are something that are evaluated by lawyers on a daily basis. And when we're talking about asbestos, we don't just try and handle these on our own. We go to experts. We've got Ryan Lutz from Corey Watson's firm, great law firm in town. And not only do I know Ryan as an asbestos guy that has knowledge of asbestos, Ryan is also just a great lawyer in his own right, and has practiced with me and against me in cases over the years, and does a great job with his firm, Corey Watson. So we're proud to have you on today.
Well, thanks for the introduction.
Was that a good enough introduction? I can do more.
That's absolutely fantastic.
Could you imagine waking up every day and somebody says, "Hey, I'm Ryan Lutz"?
That's right.
Let's talk in general terms, because I think probably there's some viewers out there that have heard the concept of asbestos, understand that there are these asbestos-related injuries. But Ryan, talk to us just a little bit about what is this product, and why is it so prevalent even in today's society?
So asbestos is a mineral. It's natural, and it's basically a bundle of fibers, and those fibers can be separated into thin threads. And the reason it's so prevalent today is because the industries, shipping, manufacturing, construction, back in the 50s and 60s, they used asbestos because it was so resistant to heat and fire.
Okay. So do we still see it in today's industry? I mean, I know it's been banned, and we can talk about that in a minute, but is it still out there in society?
It absolutely is still out there in society, because you know, we still have buildings that were built in the 1950s. We still have ships that were constructed back then, and you know, they didn't go into your next question. What I believe is in your next question, which is that the Consumer Product Safety Commission did not partially ban the use of asbestos until the late 70s. I think it was 78 or 79, and then the EPA in 1989 banned the use of asbestos in anything that was a new use. So you've got asbestos being used up until at least 1989, and it's still very prevalent in older construction and industry.
All right, so in today's industry, if you've got asbestos, for example, in floor tiles, I think from a lawyer's perspective, the answer to this question, is it dangerous, is yes, but what is it that activates the danger associated with asbestos if you've got floor tiles that have not been adjusted or manipulated or changed over the last 35, 40 years, all of a sudden can become dangerous? Is it that there's home construction, there's work being done that can aggravate these fibers into society again, or kind of into the atmosphere again?
Absolutely, because these fibers are so small, they're released into the air, and so let's say you are working, you're taking tile out of your pre-1950 home, and you're taking that tile up and it's going to cause dust, and that dust has got the asbestos in it, and so when you breathe that in, those asbestos fibers will get into your lungs and they stay there forever. And whether they cause the disease or not, it is really dependent on the amount of exposure and how long you were exposed to it.
Go ahead, Dave.
I just wonder, what diseases come about through, like if it gets in your lungs and in your body, what sort of diseases do we hear about that may be asbestos related?
Well, I think the main disease that everybody hears about, I think people see it on the commercials all the time, is mesothelioma.
Okay.
That is a malignant cancer. It is 100% fatal, and the only cause of mesothelioma is asbestos-related inhalation.
Right.
So there are also other types of injuries that are short of meso that are significant injuries that can cause significant problems.
That's correct. There's really two other kinds. You have asbestosis, which is essentially the asbestos fibers get into your lungs and they cause irritation and they cause inflammation in your lungs. And they can, it can be mild or it can be severe, and severe can be, can be fatal. And then you have other cancers. You have cancers like lung cancer, stomach cancer, their colon cancer that can be caused by the asbestos fibers getting into your system and then causing those cancers.
You mentioned earlier, and I think you were kind of alluding to this, not every exposure to asbestos is a fatal exposure. It does depend on things like dose and duration. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. The amount really is dependent on the dose. So if you're exposed to it, the more you're exposed to it, the more likely you are to have these conditions that we just spoke about. The duration, if you're exposed to it for a week versus years and years, you're going to be more likely to have these unfortunate illnesses.
What cases have you all seen? How does this give us an example of what cases of these diseases related to asbestos? What do they look like, or is it normally folks? Because I kind of think in my mind, I think of folks who a long time ago worked in a factory or something where there was asbestos and then it manifests itself later. Is that the most common kind of cases that you see?
Absolutely, yes, because the time for the disease to present itself can be from 10 years to 40 years. Yes. And I've represented a person who worked in a factory, in a glass factory, and 35 years later he was diagnosed with mesothelioma. So it's a latent disease, and it really varies.
When we come back from break, because I know we're about to go out, I want to talk about something that kind of dovetails with that, and that is how do you prove these cases? Yeah. If you're talking a latency period of 10 to 40 years, how does Ryan and how does his firm go and improve these cases and find where your asbestos exposure was in your life and how to litigate that case? Because that's a really complicated area of this whole type of law, and I want to be able to talk about it.
All right, well, we'll step aside right there as we head to break. We'd love to have your questions related to asbestos. If you've worked with it in the past, some things you might like to know. Your opportunity tonight to speak with a legal expert that can answer those questions. Call the number you see there to speak with an attorney who's standing by right now, or you can text or email the questions to us and we'll pass them along. Stay tuned. More of the attorneys coming right up.
I'm Carter Clay with the law firm of Hollis, Wright. Thanks for watching The Attorneys on WVTM 13. Now we hope you, a friend, or a loved one never need legal counsel for a case. But if you do, the goal of this show is simple: to provide answers and legal counsel when you need it the most. Your call to the show is free, so if you have questions specific to this show or related to other specific legal matters, call, email, or text us to talk with one of our lawyers. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter to learn about important legal news that could affect you or your family member. Or simply contact us by going to WVTM13.com and click on the Attorneys link. Now we know your time is valuable, so thank you for spending it with us and for watching The Attorneys right here on WVTM 13.
Well, a 40-year latency period is incredible. Talking about asbestos and asbestos-related illnesses and factors. Would love to have you be a part of the conversation. You can call, text, email, however is the easiest for you. Join the conversation. We'll pass those questions along to our panel of experts. Josh?
I know, Ryan, that the science behind asbestos is one very complicated area, and it's why you want to go to lawyers that understand this law. But proving the link between a science-related injury and asbestos-related injury and how the person got their exposure has got to be just as complicated in these cases.
Absolutely. It's very complicated because, I mean, what you're typically dealing with is exposure that occurred back in 1970, 1960, 1980. I mean, it can be so far back that, you know, the person who's exposed to those products doesn't necessarily have the best recollection of those products. So it's very important to contact someone who is experienced in that type of litigation, because they can help the client remember and recall what asbestos products they were exposed to.
Yeah, and let's talk just a little bit about the types of things that you'd look for an asbestos-related product. I mean, what are some of the questions that you ask of individuals to try and determine how they may have gotten their exposure?
So the first thing we look at is work history. The work history is the most important, because you can look at all the fields and determine whether those fields may have been exposed to asbestos. For example, if you were a roofer, we know that asbestos was manufactured in all the shingles. If you were a carpenter, there was asbestos in the drywall, in the mud compounds. And then if you worked in the automotive industry, if you worked on brakes, there was asbestos on the brake linings.
So I would imagine trying to go back, look at work history, and then determine what entity may have either manufactured the asbestos or created the exposure is still a complicated concept.
It's very complicated. You have to go back and see where products were distributed, and you have to have a knowledge of where products were distributed. Some products were only distributed in the South versus the Southeast. And
talk a little bit about statute of limitations, because, you know, traditionally there are rules that after a certain amount of time you can't even file a lawsuit, but asbestos is a little unique, it's a little different. How does the statute work? Where then the statute is, just so the viewers remember, the time frame within which you can file. How does that work with asbestos?
So typically with asbestos, it's not, the statute does not start running from the date of exposure. It actually starts running from the date that you had symptoms related to the disease. So, you know, for example, if you were diagnosed with mesothelioma, then the date that you were diagnosed with mesothelioma would likely be the date that your statute begins to run. And when your statute begins to run, that means you likely have, depending on the state, 2 years from that date to file a lawsuit, or else you're forever barred.
Ryan, talk a little bit about the importance of the contingency fee contract and how that works in these type cases.
Well, in a contingency fee contract, you come to the lawyer agrees to take your case on a percentage, and the lawyer will essentially front all the expenses and do all the work, and if you recover, you pay the lawyer a percentage of that contract.
Something that's negotiated on the front end between the client and the lawyer.
Yes.
And you know, we talk a lot about the importance of the contingency fee contract, but this type of case is a great example. You know, one of the things that's nice about the contingency fee contract, David, is it gives the plaintiff, the victim, the ability to have the same level of service as the corporate side does in how they defend these asbestos cases. And in complicated cases where you may have a significant latency period like we've talked about, where you've got to really search somebody's background and determine where the asbestos was manufactured, who it was manufactured by, and how you're going to prosecute the case, the contingency fee contract is super significant. One of the other questions or issues I wanted to get into, Ryan, is how is this diagnosed? I mean, I know people have lung-related issues because they smoke, because they had forms of cancer, because they have a hereditary condition that may impact them, but how do you determine that something is asbestos-related, whether it's asbestosis or mesothelioma? How do you determine that? What is it done through a series of medical appointments, diagnostic tests? How does that work?
Yeah, so you know, if you do think you have been exposed to asbestos, you should go consult with your doctor. And when you go to your doctor, you're essentially going to have a physical examination. Some of the symptoms can include, you know, persistent coughing. You got some blood in your cough. You know, emphysema-like symptoms. It's all respiratory related usually when it shows up. And so you go to the doctor, and the doctor will usually ask you whether you have been exposed to asbestos, and you know, that's very important in helping to diagnose that. Now you can do a chest x-ray which will show whether you have asbestos fibers in your lungs. So that's the way to go about doing that.
How does smoking affect risk here?
Now smoking can, if you smoke and you have been exposed to asbestos, you have a 50% greater chance of having lung cancer as opposed to non-smokers. So it is a synergistic effect.
Yeah.
We're getting ready to go to break. All right. When we get back, I do want to talk about this. There are some high-profile recent examples of how asbestos has impacted workers in society. Recent example in the last decade in New York. Want to talk a little bit about that and just what people should be looking for out in society that could be a dangerous environment for them.
Okay, we'll pick up right there whenever we come back. As we step aside, a reminder of how you can join the conversation. One more segment to do so, go ahead and get in touch with us. You can call, text, email. Also, if you search the firm on Facebook, you'll find them there, and on Twitter, it's Hollis_Wright. Stay tuned. Final segment of The Attorneys is coming right up.
I'm Carter Clay with the law firm of Hollis, Wright. When someone whose unreasonable conduct causes an injury to someone else, the law says that person is negligent. So it seems the injured person should receive some type of damages, right? Not always so in Alabama. In tonight's Legal 411, we answer the question, what is contributory negligence and comparative fault? Alabama is one of only 4 states in the nation to withhold damages based on contributory negligence, meaning if you are at fault, even just a little, you cannot be allowed any damages in a case. For example, in a case where a defendant may be 99% at fault for hurting you, if you are found to be 1% at fault, Alabama law says you get nothing. 4 states, Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and Alabama, plus the District of Columbia, are the only places in the country where a defendant can completely avoid paying if the injured person is even 1% at fault. This is very different from comparative fault, the measure used in 46 states. There are 2 versions of this system, but both essentially allow money damages based on the percentages. For example, if the injured person was 20% at fault for causing an accident, then the recovery for medical bills and wages is reduced by 20%. Numerous studies across the country show that people who live in comparative fault states believe this system of justice is more fair. Please remember, your call, email, or text to the attorneys is free. All of us at Hollis Wright want to help answer your questions on real issues you face. Remember, a competent lawyer will always respond to every question you send in. That's our pledge and promise to you.
Welcome back into the final segment of the attorneys. Just a few minutes remaining. If you want to join the conversation, call, text, email, get those questions into us. Josh?
There are some recent examples, I say recent, in the last decade to 15 years, pretty high profile circumstances. I know 9/11 was one of them. Kind of talk a little bit about that and what you're seeing generally.
Yeah, so 9/11 is a great example. When the World Trade Center came down, a lot of the World Trade Center had asbestos in it, and so as you can imagine, the Trade Center comes down and all the asbestos comes out and gets into the environment, and so you had a lot of the first responders, bystanders, people who were living close, breathe in the fibers, and they had exposure, and they may have these diseases later in life.
And that's kind of a mess, because when you say the final comment there, later in life, I mean, this could be a long latency period before somebody even develops that. Absolutely.
I think we went over it earlier today. 10 to 40 years, even 50 years. It's unknown how long it takes to actually cause the underlying disease, but we do know that it is a long latency period.
Now, I know there are people, Ryan, that are sitting on their couch right now that are saying to themselves, goodness, I have a house that was built, in 1950 or 1945, and I know I don't have lead paint on my walls anymore because we repainted and it's safe for my kids in that perspective. Do I need to be worried about asbestos in my house? I mean, I know that's a question you've probably gotten before. How do you handle that generally?
Absolutely, absolutely, and you need to make sure that if you are doing any construction-related activities at your house, that you hire a contractor that is knowledgeable about the issue and that will do his best to protect your interests.
Mm-hmm. There is, I have a recent case that is a property-related case, David, where there was some damage through a fire to some property, and there was asbestos-related tiles involved, and they had to bring in a whole team to properly take those tiles out to protect the family, protect the home, and even the workers that were working on it, to make sure that they did not aggravate the asbestos to allow it to get out.
Was it old construction? Were the tiles old? Because I kind of wonder is asbestos available in anything new today?
I think this was a house that had been refurbished several times in different areas of the house, and maybe this was some original tile. So, it's not guaranteed to cause damage. If it's handled and managed properly, people generally are probably pretty safe.
But can you find it? So if you find asbestos today, it's not going to be in a new product. It's going to be something that was used a good while ago.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Since 1989?
Yes.
Early
1989, I believe.
89. The EPA banned it. It's a known carcinogen, and the EPA kind of stepped in. There are no products that should be manufactured in the United States that have asbestos in them subsequent to that time frame. And really, it probably goes back to when the Consumer Protection Group got involved. But like was being said earlier, David, I think you mentioned it, and I know Ryan did, and that is that when you have this long latency period, I mean, there are things that were manufactured pre-1970, 1980. That when they're refurbished, when they're torn down, they're not properly managed, it could cause problems and significant issues.
What jobs are at the highest risk, or maybe even were at the highest risk? Like most of the cases you see, what are the jobs that those folks had?
Industrial jobs, people who were exposed to insulation. Insulation was one of the major known manufacturers of asbestos, because it does a good job of insulating everything, and it's also fire resistant. So insulation, you got to look at the auto industry. People who worked with brakes and clutches were probably exposed to asbestos. Shipbuilders, those who worked in the Navy in the boiler rooms, and back when the ships had asbestos. Those are generally some of the industries that you could see.
Talk about some of these trust accounts that you guys will apply to. For example, if somebody's gone bankrupt or there's a trust that's been set up for a certain type of company or industry to protect workers that may have asbestos-related injuries, because I know that's a complicated area of this whole law. Explain that just in general terms.
So a lot of the companies that did manufacture asbestos went bankrupt. And as a result, there were bankruptcy trusts that were set up so that people who had claims, who had valid claims, could make a claim and receive some compensation from that trust. And that's essentially what it's done. Is it's allowed consumers who have been exposed to those products to make a claim and receive compensation. So
part of the role that you and your firm play in handling these asbestos-related cases, I assume, is finding the manufacturer of the asbestos, and if there is a bankruptcy and a trust set up, making claim to that trust, making claim to that amount? Absolutely.
So you first have to determine whether whether your client was exposed to that asbestos, and then the client will sign an affidavit after you've worked through the process, after you've shown them pictures, after you've done your homework. And then I think there's over 30 asbestos trusts set up. And so, it's not uncommon to have a client who was exposed to many, if not all of those asbestos related fibers. And so it can be very significant recovery for the individual claimant.
Not a case you want to handle on your own. You need counsel to be able to work your way through this.
They would have no idea how to do it.
That's right. And that's why you go to guys like this and Ryan's firm, who do a great job with asbestos-related issues. And you really need a firm that understands from the mechanics of the start of the case to the evaluation of what the person did from an industrial perspective, where they may have been exposed, the exposure pathway, and then which manufacturer may have manufactured the asbestos so that you can make claim to it. I mean, it's a complicated process, and that's why you want to go to lawyers like Ryan.
About a minute and a half remaining. Both of you, just a final thought from you, and Ryan, we'll start with you.
Well, asbestos it's unbelievably still in our society, and it still affects a lot of people. And as Josh was saying, it's important to get your case to the attorney who knows how to do it, who can help you maximize any potential recovery that you can receive.
Yeah, and I think what I would end with, David, is as people get older, they develop lung-related conditions, and if your doctor is evaluating a lung-related condition for you and you end up being diagnosed with something, or there's a potential that you're being diagnosed with something because they say they want to monitor it and watch it for a longer period of time, don't be afraid to at least consult with somebody like Ryan's firm. Come to us and we'll get you to Ryan's group to make sure that if your statute's running, you are handling it on the front end and making sure you're protecting your statute, because there are ways to protect the statute and to protect yourself if you have any of these injuries.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Completely out of time. Appreciate both of you being with us. Thank you for joining us as well. As we wrap things up, here's how you can get in touch with the firm of Hollis Wright. If you failed to get your question in time, call, text, email. Would love to see you next week. We'll look for you then on the next edition of The Attorneys.
Thanks for watching The Attorneys, sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright.